So it's been a great day for me. It's wonderful to see all of you, and it's great for me to be able to honor people who I know well and love and respect. And one of those is our next awardee for the INPCS Lifetime Achievement Award, which is Roop Gursahani, who joins us from India, and actually, again, is a person who I think we wouldn't be here, or at least wouldn't be the way we are here today without him. I remember we were at a Palatucci forum. The American Academy of Neurology has these trainings in advocacy, and Roop was a graduate, and Roop did probably their best project ever, which was that he made advanced care planning a thing in India. He made it a law, and it wasn't before that. So, I mean, that by itself was amazing. But so he was me and Claire's mentor. And I don't even remember what my project was or what Claire's project was, but the three of us talked about, wouldn't it be cool to have like a neuropalliative care society? And I think that really planted the seed for a lot of things to come. So as I mentioned, Roop has been a driving force behind advanced care planning in India, behind palliative care in general in India. He's probably done more than any other single individual to get neuropalliative care off the ground in India. And he's brought many of us here in this room to India, and we have learned a ton, actually, from his colleagues. There's some very inspiring work in community-based palliative care. The scope of the work and the scope of the problems that he and his colleagues are working on is just tremendous. This taught me so much. He's also always talking about, I think I learned this from him, of big, hairy, audacious goals, BHAG, and I think people assume that I'm the master of that, and I definitely have big, hairy, and audacious goals, but Roop has huge, big, hairy, audacious goals that he has pursued and achieved, and he continues to achieve. The International Certificate Program in India is going into its third year and has trained, I believe, over 90 people in neuropalliative care across the world. He's been a huge part of us being truly an international society, making sure that Asia, Africa, and other countries are represented. And if for no other reason, we owe him this award because he's always doing meetings at 3 a.m. And I've only partially paid him back by presenting for his groups at weird hours of the day. But for all of that, and for anyone who's ever met him, he's just such an inspiring and energetic individual. So we welcome you up, and thank you so much, Roop, for all of your work.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Benzi and everybody else who thought I was, well, worthy of this. I would have been in this meeting regardless, but this gave my 30-hour flight both meaning and purpose. Next slide. Okay, this is it. This is the big green button. I think I missed the no disclosures. Anyway, this, I think I had put that in, but anyway. This talk is largely me reliving all the rabbit holes that I've explored in this past decade. I hope you find them as fascinating as I did. I hope to give you an idea of how and why things are the way they are, especially in the way that it affects what we do in this field. I'm not the first to say it, but the world is what it is, and we have to make the best of what we have. Right. I live and work in Mumbai, India, as a solo practice neurologist. And my friend Kailash Bhatia, whom some of you may know, told me that in the UK I would be called a commercial neurologist. Anyway, it all began for me with a call from Delhi sometime in January 2011 from a guy called Justice Kajju. He was then a sitting Supreme Court judge. Our judges retire, unlike yours. So so he had to be there when he called me. But the story actually began late evening, November 27, 1973. Aruna Shanbag was a 25-year-old, vivacious, perhaps somewhat sharp-tongued uh, nurse in a public hospital in Mumbai, the King Edward Memorial Hospital. She was engaged to be married to a neurosurgery resident, and she was posted in the animal lab. And that is where she had a problem with one of the orderlies. That evening, he assaulted her, holding her down with a dog chain around her neck, and sodomized her because she was menstruating. Amazingly, she survived. She was found the next morning and apparently never even required ventilatory support. That was 1973. But she was severely brain damaged. I examined her only once in February 2011 as directed by Justice Kajju, and she was somewhat better than vegetative, perhaps minimally conscious state minus, and she could be fed orally. Over these years, successive generations of KEM nurses took devoted care of her. In fact, the incoming batch of student nurses would be led to meet her. She became an idol, a mascot, and their baby all rolled into one. And then she became our equivalent of Karen Quinlan and Terry Schiavo. The court case was filed by a somewhat publicity-minded writer asking for the hospital to stop her care and to let her pass on. The judges kind of refused that plea but confirmed the legality of withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment from a patient incapable of giving consent. And since the hospital administration, the nurses weren't willing to give up on her, she finally died naturally in 2015. So that was about Aruna. Around this time, I was already involved in advocacy of a kind. The first initiative was something that we called the Forum for Indian Neurology Education, which my friend Sudhir, you can see him there, and some colleagues set up. We organize courses for neurologists and internists, and our guiding principle is that if we as organizers feel we need to learn something, the best way to do is to organize a course, which is where the spiritual care course yesterday happened. We have decent pharma support with the usual regulatory issues, and we were really on a roll before the pandemic. That got us to a complete halt. So you can see the representative year of 2018. Amongst other courses, we ran Neuropalliative care, and Janice, Maisha, David, Benzi have all been across to teach. The second project was with something called the Lifeline Express. You can see the train in the corner. This is a hospital train that goes to remote locations that are almost completely unserved by public health care. My friend Mamta Bhushan Singh, who's setting up a project in palliative care in severe epilepsy, set up the epilepsy clinic there. We would do 7 to 9 weekends in a year. And I remember one weekend where between the two of us, we saw 300 patients. I knew epilepsy could be disabling, but I did not know how disfiguring it could be where there is no health care. These are injuries that adolescents and adults get during seizures, and I have never seen anything like this in Mumbai, so in the same country. So when Mamta suggested that I apply for a PALF fellowship, I was primed. Now, the Donald Palatucci Advocacy and Leadership Forum was set up by the American Academy of Neurology to train neurologists. And as part of the course, each attendee has to prepare an action plan for an issue that concerns them. And I chose end-of-life care because Aruna's case was still stuck in my mind. The Supreme Court had given us some wiggle room, but not enough. And that was the epiphany that actually struck me there. That I was 56, and then when it was my time to go, I didn't want the laws of my country to stand in my way. So later that year, a coalition of intensivist palliative care physicians and neurologists came into being. We called it ELICIT, End of Life Care in India Task Force. And another rabbit hole, that of neuropalliative care, appeared around about the same time. Maisha was in my group in 2015. She had just finished her neurology residency, and she was about to begin the palliative care fellowship. And when I went back again next time, as Benzi told you, Benzi and Claire were there in my group. The point that I'm making is that for me, advocacy has been serendipitous. I stumbled into projects with friends and one thing led to another. It could be more planned and predictable for someone else, but when somebody asks me, how do you do advocacy? I really have no answers beyond, say, what ChatGPT would probably give you. Obviously, it has to be something that you're passionate about, and then you make an action plan, and that's it. And then you get going. So, beginning 2015, we were able to get support from a bunch of outstanding lawyers. Unfortunately, the first to join us, and that's another big story, Girish Gokhale, the black box, he's no more. But then Dhwani Mehta and Arvind Datar, obviously names not familiar to you, but they've really, really been just great. And then we were also favored by luck. Now, liberty in any constitution is a political construct. It needs judges or lawmakers or both to explore it in the personal space. And the Supreme Court of India did just that. In the span of a little over a year, they looked at and opened up the right to privacy, the right of sexual choice for LGBTQ, and the right to autonomy in healthcare decisions, all by approximately the same bunch of judges. In the judgment on health autonomy, the Chief Justice of India actually stated that everybody has a right to decide on any kind of health treatment, even if, say, refusing that treatment causes that person's death. And if that is done in advance, then that has to be respected. This may seem pretty obvious to you, but these statements actually did not exist in Indian jurisprudence. They just did not. So when this came out, it was obviously big, but the judges added riders, which in effect made this judgment impossible to implement on the ground. They wanted a local judge to sign out on each AMD and on each withdrawal. That obviously was not happening. So this is something that we have to understand. This is a common feature of constitutional courts, such as the Indian Supreme Court or even SCOTUS. They are in the business of clarifying principles, right? Based on universal ethics and that nation's constitutional morality. Yours, of course, is much older, but ours was written just about in 1950. So courts tend to be extra cautious when they think they might be encroaching on lawmakers' territory, because parliaments, senates, legislative houses, ideally based on the same principles, ethics and constitutional morality, have to make implementable laws. Laws which state, thou shalt not, on pain of. And both courts and lawmakers have to keep in mind the Zeitgeist. For medicine, the Zeitgeist is constructed by a trifecta of public awareness, practice, and guidelines. And so although we hear the term standing on the shoulders of giants, I really don't agree. The world and our Zeitgeist is built by legions of us dwarfs. In India, the professional guidelines are in place. Public awareness is evolving. But guess what is lacking? Our professional colleagues' practice of end-of-life care. Way behind both these other two. So 5 years later, and this delay was because of the pandemic, the Supreme Court removed the judicial rider on our back, and advanced medical directives as well as foregoing life support actually became feasible. We are effectively at the end of the beginning. The laws and guidelines are in place, and we now have to work on death literacy for the public and for our profession. So, in my 2015 action plan, the hypothetical endpoint was a comprehensive end-of-life care legislation. But I now know that an actual death law is just not politically feasible in any democracy. But with the judgments now, we have a near complete patchwork fix in place, and it almost seems like a dream. The action plan from 2015 is now almost reality, and all that I can say is, Donald Palatucci, wherever you are, take a bow. So moving on, the first meeting of what would become the INPCS was on the sidelines of the AA in 2017, 2018, sorry. And our own weekend courses by Fine had been going on from the previous year. In fact, the last one was just 3 weeks before the pandemic hit India. Benzi was there and he flew back just after end of February, I think. Anyway, and then the pandemic struck. And with nothing better to do, I worked on getting myself an education in palliative care. So in India, we have something called the National Fellowship in Palliative Care, which permits a lateral entry from any specialty and at any age. And this model is important. It's largely online because you cannot ask somebody who's mid-career or beyond, say like me, to make a shift to palliative care by taking a year off and doing a formal clinical fellowship. Can't happen. So this is a blended model where you have to do 10 days of online didactic teaching, 20 days of clinical work, and another 11 months worth of assignments wherever you are. So about a year. 3 of us neurologists took it on. Rajendra Dhamija, who's here with me today, Praful Chembalkar and me joined. Only one of us completed, and that was definitely not me. It did not work for me because it had an oncology focus. And by then the INPCS had taken flight. So I had started it, but then along the way I kind of shifted over to the certificate course. But the model is important and I would like you to think about it as we look at expanding neuropalliative care. Maybe not for the US, but definitely for the rest of the world. So my solution was to bootstrap myself into neuropalliative care by constructing the International Neuropalliative Care Certificate course. And of course, there was a whole village that carried me along. Neha Kramer, and she's not here, and Jessica Besbris were awesome. They recruited the villagers. Some of you are here, making sure that timelines were met, curbing my tendency to mission creep, overrun, rabbit holes, everything. They kept my nose down. And we launched the first edition in the summer of 2022. As the pandemic ended, the third year has just started. A little bit of detail about the course, and I'd like you to look at this. It's open to physicians from all streams, not just neurologists and palliative care physicians. You could be geriatricians, rehab docs, neurosurgeons, internists, whatever. For nurses, we do insist on specialization either in palliative care or neurology. This is how it works. Registrants get access to 5 to 6 webinars every month. These webinars are in 3 streams. So there's neurology for non-neurologists because there is something called neurophobia and we need to tackle that. Then palliative care for people who are not, basics for people who are not familiar with palliative care, and the bulk of it is neuropalliative care essentials. And each webinar has 5 MCQs and the participants have to complete 80% of the total MCQs. At the end of each month, we have a live online case discussion, largely aligned to the webinars. I'll be doing that next Saturday. There is one in-person session over a weekend for comm skills, but these comm skills too are anchored in detailed case scenarios, and we try and incorporate prognostication and ethics together with the discussion, because otherwise, at least outside palliative care, people find it rather difficult to, take it in. The course emphatically does not work like a book. Not like chapters 1, A to Z. No, it does not. It runs the way I learned neurology, learning added to learning until finally the jigsaw puzzle falls into place. And so far, people do seem to like it. But there's another one of my rabbit holes that opened at the same time. And my understanding of cultural psychology and realizing that I and many of my colleagues are actually pretty weird in the Indian context. There's a book. It's actually, I think that slide, you can see that there. Uh, it's to do with why good people disagree. And I can only think that if Hillary Clinton had did this back in 2016, she would never have made that deplorables comment. Because it really tells you that people have different ideas. So, in a sense, I'm weird. Only the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic profile strongly believes in individual autonomy. My sense of individual autonomy is not really very different from yours, except that I'm more conscious of my relational constraints. But my Indian patients don't read biomedical ethics. They have never read Beauchamp's filters. And for many of us, it is community. In Asians, community is very big. Family, duty, hierarchy, and so on. For Indians, there is also sanctity or purity. And this has a major effect on attitudes to death, dying, caregiving, and decision making. And we need to be aware of this. This is truly important because I think neuropalliative care is 70 to 80% prognostication and ethics. And this is where we differ from oncopalliative care. Janice and Benzi made me write the chapter on international models of neuropalliative care in the handbook. And that forced me to understand how much and why palliative care differs across the world. We do need to be conscious of this. And what follows is a survey of the Indian situation. And lessons from there are applicable everywhere. As I said before, the world is what it is. To understand this, we need to go back to the origins of palliative care. We all know the Cicely Saunders story, from medical social worker to nurse to doctor, establishing morphine use along the way. And her views on her work was certainly not insular. Just read that quote in the corner. She made that. It's up there on the Cicely Saunders website. But there's one point that many people don't understand, and that is the beginning of palliative care in the United Kingdom overlaps with the establishment of their universal healthcare system, the National Health Service. And I'm not sure one would have happened without the other. Those are counterfactuals that you can, figure out. 50 years later, we now have country rankings for palliative care, end-of-life care, and quality of death, and these come out roughly every 5 years. With its head start, the United Kingdom has always been number one, all three of them. The US is low down in grade C. India is close to the bottom of grade D. So obviously this has nothing to do with wealth and healthcare spend. What probably matters most is the establishment of universal healthcare in that particular country. What matters next is the recognition of palliative care. And here, morphine use is like a litmus test. But obviously palliative care training for healthcare workers matters, public awareness of dying matters, and a commitment to patient autonomy all matter. How does this work in India? The reason why I'm kind of doing a deep dive on this is because the messy reality of contemporary India mirrors the diversity of the world. So a little bit about India. Although India has been a civilizational entity for over 3 millennia, a little less than a century ago, Winston Churchill said that India was as much a nation as was the equator. Well, today we know that as a democratic political entity, India stands between the US and Europe, more diverse than the USA and more united than Europe. If you ever travel to India, this will probably explain to you the differences that you see as you travel across. As an aside, whenever you are in India next, have a look at any denomination rupee note. The intaglio on the reverse states the denomination in 15 languages and 10 scripts. And we actually have 22 official languages. And yet, we are a nation. So, if I look at healthcare across India, remember my example from epilepsy? Think palliative care and you might wonder how different states perform. You can expect palliative care provision to roughly match the level of primary healthcare, and here I'm using the under 5 mortality rate as an indicator. The southern state of Kerala, there you see them in green, have stats similar to Cuba and Germany. A northern, you could call it the redneck state, of Uttar Pradesh matches Burundi in sub-Saharan Africa and Afghanistan. And COVID brought this into full focus. Our COVID mortality was 5 million, mainly from the northern states. And this picture is of bodies buried in shallow sandy graves on the banks of the Ganges. The orange spots you see are shrouds. Will India ever get universal health care? Looks unlikely for roughly the same reasons as in the USA. People don't agree about equality. People don't want to pay for people who are not like them. And casteism in India is the same as racism here, and so on. So because of this, we kind of look at your own attempt with Obamacare, and it was so difficult to finally get it through. Anyway, for universal healthcare to work, finally you have to provide public healthcare that is so good that even the rich will use it. And once you do it, then it cannot be trumped by the private sector. So insurance is a bit of a substitute, but what you really need is care that is free at the point of getting it. So how is palliative care provided? In India at least. Currently this is mostly oncopalliative care. Wherever it is being provided through the public sector system, it kind of matches whatever the basic care is. Enlightened private hospitals have now begun to provide palliative care. We don't have insurance support for it, and nothing at all like your hospice system, which really is quite a marvel. The burden is largely taken up by non-for-profits wherever they exist. But there is a really bright spot, and that is the small southern state of Kerala. This is the compassionate communities and neighborhood networks model that I'm going to speak about next. Most villages have a local self-sustained palliative care unit. And in the one that I visited, this was some years ago, at a village tea shop, I saw this, a collection box for palliative care. I'm going to spend a little time on this because this has universal lessons. The first is that when the community decides who needs palliative care, the needle swings completely away from oncology. Advanced cancer now accounts for just 30% of the Kerala community caseload. Spinal injury, stroke, end-stage systemic disease, old age with multimorbidity account for about 15 to 20% each, with childhood and adult neurodegenerative disease accounting for about 5%. Given the fact that we really don't have social services, there is a bit of an overlap, and that's, I think, okay. A short bit about how this model works. The bulk of the work is done by about 15 to 20 self-recruited and trained. The training is not very long. Local volunteers who are organized usually by village. That is a neighborhood network. Palliative care nurses come from local not-for-profits or the local municipality. Together they support and empower families in basic care of patients who are bedridden. Primary care doctors play a supervisory role, and a large part of the entire budget is met from local government. But the Kerala model is an aspiration that has been difficult to replicate. And the secret sauce is a somewhat bit of a mouthful, poisonous for social innovation. This is actually a paper in a management journal that looks at how and why Kerala got there. Well, Kerala has had over 2 millennia of trade with the world, starting from the BC, from the Roman Empire. A history of enlightened leadership for the past 2 centuries. And egalitarianism is substantially ingrained, unlike North India's casteism. Sounds familiar? All of this culminated in the world's first elected communist government in the 1950s. Actually, Kerala got that. Anyway, but if we set aside the specifics of the Kerala model, there are reasons for hope across India. This is a statement by the doyen of palliative care, Dr. Rajgopal. The first is that government has accepted that palliative care is a right. Opioid rules have been eased. Palliative care education has crept into is substantially in the undergraduate curriculum. Postgraduate PC is expanding. And we've already spoken about constitutional validation of healthcare autonomy. And the last frontier is literally public awareness. But neuropalliative care everywhere has some very specific and very distinct challenges. And I'm not going to read this in detail, but you understand we've been speaking about this, the difficulties in prognosis, uh, the difficulties of getting neurologists to work with palliative physicians, for them to accept that they might lose authority over their patients. But there's more. There is neurophobia from the other side. Palliative care physicians are extremely reluctant to take on anything that has neuro in it. So, how do we get past that? Well, I have two ways that I'm going to try and answer that. The first is my own, the way I function. While, and then of course, a more broader recognition. Sorry, what has happened? Yeah, sorry. I think the slides have gotten a bit mixed. Okay. I'm actually going to speak first about my other major concern, and that's advanced care planning. So remember that while palliative care was getting established in the United Kingdom, simultaneously the US was becoming the world's laboratory for patient autonomy and rights. So the 1960s, saw astounding medical progress, the end of medical paternalism, and also the beginning of the medicalization of death. It was also a time of tremendous political ferment for you, marked by your civil rights movement. So it was only appropriate that living wills were first proposed by a civil rights lawyer. California was the first with state legislation, and then state after state signed up. And by 1991, the US Patient Self-Determination Act was in place. For most of you, this is all in the background. In the 2000s, the importance of the healthcare proxy was recognized, and we started to use the Advanced Medical Directive. And advanced care planning was recognized as the process and conversation of death literacy. As an aside, I can now see the USA arguing with itself about gender issues. And that's perhaps more fraught than with ACP, but still, it's the only way a society can sort out difficult matters. In that sense, the USA is still the world's only city on the hill. Only I'm not sure your MAGA crowd would appreciate this as a compliment. So, right. But there's another interconnected problem, and that is there's a marked difference between oncologic and non-oncologic deaths. In oncology, once the inflection point is crossed, cancer biology makes all the decisions, medical, ethical, legal, although the patient and family retain some control if there is transparency. In neurologic and non-oncologic dying, there is a lot of decision making to be done, a lot of heavy lifting by all concerned, including obviously the doctors and the families. Prognosis, ethics, legal, because of the inherent uncertainty. And personhood may be lost early, recurrent admissions may be unavoidable, and well, we need to understand that these are literally two streams in palliative care. The second is palliative care and advanced care planning have been in separate silos for all their 5 decades. Palliative care was born for cancer in a straightforward beneficence, non-maleficence ethic in a universal healthcare system in the United Kingdom. Advanced care planning, in contrast, was born out of the ethics of rights, with challenges to personal autonomy in non-oncologic situations in the context of largely private medical care in the USA. Right? So it's unusual for ACP and palliative care to get together. But the ACP umbrella is now quite capacious. From the AMD all the way through DNAR, POLST, including organ donor registration. And don't forget that if you look at donation after cardiac death, not donation after brain death, you do need all of this in place. All of us have read this paper by Dr. Morrison, where he said there was no evidence for the efficacy of ACP. Sorry to put it this way, but his background in legacy oncopalliative care kind of tells us where he's coming from. For me, how can you throw out death literacy, goal concordant care, shared decision making? All of these flow from ACP. And to me, that seems like a self-evident truth. Perhaps we are looking for evidence in the wrong place. So ACP in neurology has special challenges. Again, uncertainty in diagnosis, prognosis, uh, especially in predicting future quality of life. We've just spoken about that. And people often cope with disability better than expected. We have cognitive and communication issues. Care partners and family need to be invested in these discussions. So, one possible future project that I would like to look for is comprehensive guidance for neurologists across ACP. I think this is a project for this society. And I hope to see it sometime. So, how do we get ACP going in India? As of now, we have no government support. But over the last year or so, the officers of the Indian Association of Palliative Care have come around to the idea that palliative care is a natural home of ACP, much as vaccination is now the job of pediatricians, right? The plan is to set up a dedicated not-for-profit and to combine it with a death literacy campaign. We will need to teach the ACP process to anyone who wishes to sign on as facilitator. We need to draft and validate ACP instruments and prepare train-the-trainer programs and so on. So again, an action plan. So moving on to the last section of my talk, how does neuropalliative care work for me and what does it mean to me? Have I dropped a slide? Right, I think it's probably ahead. Anyway, so when I look at the intersections between neurology, medicine and palliative care, these are my thoughts and I'm happy to discuss this further. When we begin training in neurology, localization is the holy grail. And Occam's razor or the law of parsimony really holds. And with the explosion of diagnostic and therapeutic options, it's easy to get locked into the ideology of one gene, one antibody, one epileptogenic focus and so on. Unfortunately, that way lies Sauron, one ring to rule them all, right? In fact, when I see movement disorder case presentations, too often I see this version of the patient had this and the patient had that and the patient had that and then we found the gene. And look, here is the literature. And then we, the neurologist, lived happily ever after. Wow. And then when you get into neurology in practice or into neurointensive care or as neurohospitalists, subspecialties matter much less. And then we have Hickham's dictum. Patients can have as many diseases as they please. Here so often we see our patients and their families ground down between the immovable limits of biology and the irresistible force of medical technology. And here we cannot help unless we commit to prognostication. From the time of Hippocrates, this has been as important a function of medicine as diagnosis and therapeutics, but prognostication inevitably means both foreseeing and foretelling. And if you do not commit to foretelling, your foresight will atrophy. So there's a paper by a guy called Nicholas Christakis who speaks of the ambivalence that results from when we need to prognosticate, because this is a process that has to be simultaneously honest, accurate, and optimistic. How do you do it? So without training in communication, that can be so painful that many of us just avoid prognostication altogether. Now, two newish neurology subspecialties were born in the last 2 decades. Both societies also were birthed in the pandemic. The Functional Neurology Disorder Society and INPCS. And Dr. Rajendra Dhamija and I are probably the only 2 common founding members in both societies. But both specialties depend on the soft skills that neurology training doesn't do too well. We could probably paraphrase McLuhan's theory to that the physician is the medium and the message. And in these days of AI, I believe the substantial part of the future of neurology lies here. I'm going to leave this train of thought here and let's see how we can explore this further. Right. So what about my own practice? Well, I practice in a private pay-as-you-go or fee-for-service system. I call it a concierge system, but I don't obviously charge a retainer or anything. My patients, when they when they're obviously palliative, they get my cell phone number with the strict instructions that they can WhatsApp me, but they have to wait for me to call back. But as they move to the hospice stage, we usually set up a WhatsApp group between the palliative care team, one or two of the caregivers, me, I mean, whoever else is concerned, and we manage with that. So effectively, I practice primary palliative care, and I lean on our palliative care physician to help me out if anything more is required. One thing that has been a journey is to incorporate ethics thinking into everything. And that is not easy. You have to learn to, along the way, handle your emotions. And as somebody else has said earlier, this requires becoming the change that you wish to see in the world. So, when you look again back at oncology palliative care, remember that oncology at some stage hands over to palliative care. That model doesn't work for us. What works for us is the roadmap model where there is no handover. If as neurologists we understand that making a diagnosis is just the beginning of a long journey, we accept the privilege of being the Sherpa who walks with a fellow human along a part or all of it. And for me, I can say that once the skills of prognostication and communication came into me, they slipped seamlessly into my daily practice. And literally the meaning and purpose of a physician, of being a physician, came alive. So, I turned 65 this July. I hope to practice for another 10 years. And at this stage, it is the village of neuropalliative care that has literally given me my ikigai. And that's quite a privilege. You can look up ikigai, it means something that combines passion, mission, vocation, and profession. And I'd like to end by thanking all my friends and my family for being in my life. My husband, Neil, unfortunately couldn't be here, but I hope to have him along next time. And I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
So I thought your question, so first of all, thank you for all of your work. I could have listened for a lot longer, so.
I was having fun.
I could tell, that was fabulous. That's maybe the best part. So I'm personally really fascinated about how the ethics of end of life and impermanence and death and dying is perceived in cultures that are not monotheistic. And I was wondering if that is something that you want to touch on now or save for a couple-hour-long presentation for some other time.
No.
That's a dissertation, I realize, but I'm really fascinated by this.
Yeah, so we look at what we call the karmic religions as opposed to the Abrahamic religions. So the karmic religions don't really look at a full stop. They don't look at, at someday, I mean, everybody's going to either go to heaven or to hell. No. It's more like an accounting. If you have too much debits on your ledger, you'll go down. You'll become a pig or a cockroach or whatever. And if you have enough credits, then you go up and up. So in some ways, there's been a lot that's said about how it impacts a sense of morality because things tend to be somewhat relative. The other part of it, because I didn't go into that, the ovals that I showed, and that is a little tricky to understand. Sanctity, the sacred, pollution. So somewhere, there's a friend of mine who works on this, and his belief is that the professions in India that dealt with death, starting from the butcher to the undertaker and the crematorium worker, those were the for some reason, at some point, they became defiling. And that's where our caste system began. That's where the lower caste, those became the original untouchables. So obviously, I mean, there's no written record of this, but that's one theory. And that's why death is taboo in India. It's really still taboo. And that is over and above the fact that most people don't like talking about death.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk, Roop.
Thanks.
You mentioned right now just caste, and then earlier caste as it relates to racism in the US. And I would wonder if you could talk about how the caste system affected the ability for you to implement palliative care in India, as we struggle with how to implement palliative care here in the US in addressing racism and structural inequities.
So this actually comes from the compassionate communities model. When you try to implement compassionate communities, you need either egalitarianism or homogeneous community. And if you don't have either of these two, then it's difficult to get humans to look at the other as also a human. And without that, palliative care doesn't work. So there's a fair amount that's been written about racism and casteism being roughly equivalent. I mean, casteism is racism without a color code, really.
Hi, I'm Sachi from the Palo Alto VA. Thanks for the great talk. I was curious about when talking about advanced care planning, I'm curious about different perceptions such as removal of certain treatments such as feeding tubes in different regions or with different religions in the country.
Treatments and religions. Sorry, would you?
Like perceptions about certain aspects such as tube feeds and removing withdrawal of those types of treatments, and if that changes based on where in the country it is or based on the different religions.
So Islam kind of looks on it more like the regular Abrahamic religions, like somewhat the Jewish traditions would look at it. So a treatment that is once started, you don't withdraw it. So, but I mean, if you discuss this in advance, then withholding is acceptable. About tube feeding, so if you're aware, there's one particular, in fact, there's a religion that's called Jainism, Jainism. It's about a century earlier than Buddhism, and actually it's said that the Buddha was influenced by that. But obviously Buddhism became much bigger. So in Jainism, they're much stronger on natural death. And in fact, they have a tradition of voluntary stopping eating and drinking, which you know is legal across, they call it Santhara. And they actually do it in state, literally. So typically this is done by holy figures, I mean, they're priests or so on. So when that gentleman or the nun decides to undertake Santhara, it becomes a celebration. It will be on a dais, there'll be people milling around, taking blessings and so on. Literally, no palliative care anywhere on the scene. But I suppose the ritual is the palliative care.
Thanks so much for your talk. I was just really fascinated by the overlap you were describing between functional neurologic disorders and neuropalliative care. And I was just curious to hear more about what you think they have in common. Is it soul? Is it clinical relationship? Thank you.
So the relationship is in some ways the fact that both completely depend on soft skills. And it's difficult to separate it from our own motivations and our institutional structures. Both the worst patients in both societies are literally the canaries in the mine. if a healthcare system can take care of our patients and well, the kind of patient that you don't want to see. A bad functional neurologic disorder patient can be really difficult to see. And if a healthcare system can take care of both of these, it is good. So at some stage, I'd like to see Benzi meet up with the FNDS officers and kind of, yeah, Mark Hallett obviously, but the Mark Edwards and John, but anyway, let's see. Maybe it's a joint project perhaps for the AN at some time.
If there's no more questions, thank Roop for a wonderful
Thank
talk
you.
and for
Thank you.
more importantly for all the wonderful work you're doing in the world, which is again breathtaking.
But I've been having fun.